Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Redlines. My guest today is Wyatt Reed. He's a journalist and producer of the show By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Wyatt, welcome to Redlines.
Hey Anya, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I know you've been back in DC for a few days now, but I wondered if you could give us a brief update on the situation in Portland at the moment as far as you're aware.
Absolutely. Things have definitely cooled down to a certain extent in Portland. Nothing like the nightly street battles that were being waged for several weeks, as I reported from here last week. I think this gives a great deal of credence to those who were saying that Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security response to protests, which was to crack down, to attempt to sort of repress the protest movement out of existence. I think it's very clear that these actions have had the opposite effect, that if anything, they generated more spontaneous unrest, outrage, and ultimately led to more provocations on the part of the police, the federal agents, and then naturally on the part of the protesters as well. In the past couple of days, the protests have simmered, much less volatile. There's certainly very little daily violence, police repression being unleashed like there was for several weeks and really for several months. It's important to note that the protests, while they have dissipated somewhat, were never really about federal government overreach or states' rights or anything sort of abstract. These kind of broader questions of how the federal and state government function, they've always been about occupation by police, whether that be by the local Portland Police Bureau or especially by these unidentified and totally unaccountable federal agents.
Mm-hmm. And how did all of this begin? Because I feel as though we weren't really hearing about Portland that much until the federal government deployed these agents. Has the Trump administration offered any clear explanation as to why it targeted Portland, or do you see this purely as part of a re-election strategy?
Well, their justification for what they've been calling Operation Legend, after a 4-year-old who was shot and killed in Kansas City, Missouri, named Legend Calafiore, I believe. The general justification, which has been given for the deployment of Customs and Border Patrol agents to Portland and other cities, has been one of violence. Now, the violence is sometimes left unspecified. It's gesture towards political violence being enacted in response to police repression, or to sort of daily, more routine violence carried out just as a matter of routine under the daily economic oppression of capitalism and the ridiculous inequality that exists so acutely in cities. So there is a broad explanation. It's not terribly convincing, fairly clearly racist. The real explanation, I think has a lot more to do with re-election, has a lot more to do with the desire on the part of reactionaries, reactionary politicians, especially Donald Trump and those around him, to generate a sort of climate of political instability and to thus be able to crack down on those he deems terrorists, Antifa, violent, whatever label he wants to slap on them, or those in the U.S. government wish to. So, in that sense, yeah, I think it's pretty clear there was never, prior to the deployment even of these agents to Portland, local reports suggested that the Black Lives Matter protests, which originally kicked off across the country in the wake of the police execution of George Floyd, those had dwindled in Portland. People said that there were less than 100 protesters at the time of the deployment of the federal agents to the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. So really, the only lens that it makes sense to view this through is, in some senses, a calculated attempt by the Trump administration to generate the kinds of outrage and unrest, which were then subsequently used to justify the same federal occupation, if you will, that he demanded.
And how did these protests differ from other demonstrations you've covered in the past? You were active amid the Black Lives Matter protests in D.C. recently, for example. Did these federal forces behave differently than local police?
Yeah, absolutely. And in another sense, this isn't something that we saw just restricted to Portland. In fact, early on in June, we saw federal agents, unidentified, masking tape covering their badges so you couldn't read what their name was, who were deployed, it turned out, from the Bureau of Prisons, specially trained prison riot jailers who were deployed in the streets of Washington, D.C. to enforce law and order. So this was not a new tactic in the sense that the federal government was deploying unidentified, sort of anonymous agents to enact state violence against protesters well before the situation in Portland. I think what changed is, a number of things. Protests had been out of the spotlight in a number of other cities where they'd been more prominent recently, including DC, especially cities like Minneapolis, though. And we see a willingness, though, as distinct from many other demonstrations against racist police terror, we see a willingness on the part of the mainstream media to embrace the protests in Portland insofar as they can portray them as being specifically against Donald Trump, insofar as they can portray them as being a conflict between Republicans and Democrats and not between the working class and the ruling class. They are more than willing to give coverage to these kinds of events. But obviously, as soon as people began making these deeper systemic critiques and really asking, what does it mean to differentiate between an occupation between these federal forces, for example, and the other federal forces who have been, in the state or local federal forces who have been enacting similar violence for years and years and years without the need for Donald Trump to come and inflame the situation. One video in particular that sticks out was the arrest by New York Police Department officers this past weekend of a young transgender woman who they manhandled, grabbed, and threw into a minivan in a scene more or less exactly equivalent to what the feds have been doing in Portland, but being carried out by these same local police forces. So we see at the end of the day that whether they are dressed in the military fatigues as these agents who seem to be acting as troops in Portland are, or whether they are dressed as normal, run-of-the-mill city cops, at the end of the day, they're enacting the same violence, and that's more than obvious to those who've been fighting this fight for since well before the latest round of protests. Those groups, including in Portland, the most notable currently would be Don't Shoot Portland, which ended up taking a pretty significant leadership role in terms of organization of the encampments, the now famous Wall of Moms, of these other instances of factions, political factions coming out in support of the broader resistance movement in Portland. So while we do see these obvious and clear parallels between the type of state repression being enacted by the federal agents and by local police forces, there is some distinction in the sense that these agents have really been operating with no clear limits in terms of what they're the violence that they're able to mete out, whether that be to protesters, innocent bystanders, or journalists like myself. The day of the injunction, which went into effect, specifically banning these federal agents from targeting journalists, I myself was targeted with a tear gas canister while I was at least 10 feet away from anyone else, nowhere near any militant protesters. Later that night, at least 3, maybe 4 other journalists were also targeted, whether that be through chemical munitions being deployed directly at them or physical violence. I heard one was targeted with a baton. So they're acting in a fairly unhinged manner, or they were, rather, prior to their sort of cessation of violence, this, for the time being, kind of ceasefire that they have been willing to not brutalize protesters for the past few nights. But ultimately, as we saw in DC, we saw again in Portland, the only limits on the types of force that these federal agents are able to deploy are those that they themselves impose.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying that you really do feel as though there was an effort to target press throughout your experience in Portland. You also...
I felt at the time it happened, I hadn't been long in Portland. It was my second night. I felt a little bit uneasy at that point because I have sort of a sense of, a journalistic desire to make sure that I get the facts straight. I didn't want to portray this as them specifically targeting me. As the night developed, and I met so many more people, members of the media who had been targeted, it became obvious. And as the week went on, I was targeted not with physical violence, but harassed by a number of agents who appeared to be with BORTAC, this supposedly highly trained special agent responsible for, as they say, or as they portray themselves, capturing high-level drug trafficking suspects. So it was never extremely clear why such a violent group, and a group which, as an aside, I'm blanking on the name, but a woman who worked worked for Border Patrol prior to 2001 for, I believe, 8 years, referred to BORTAC as the most racist unit in the entirety of Customs and Border Patrol, which I think says a lot given what we know about the kind of racism that is rampant in that agency. But yes, I do think they were targeting journalists, and this isn't idle speculation anymore. We now know, thanks to some excellent reporting that's come out of The Nation about attempts by the Department of Homeland Security to essentially treat journalists how they treat those on the FBI most wanted list or terrorists, and create a sort of baseball card deck of most wanted style journalists and protesters. So these are being handed around, distributed by these agents. So we know in that regard as well, they were heavily surveilling journalists who they deemed oppositional. And even today, Ken Klippenstein released another article with The Nation. This one showing that the Department of Homeland Security is compiling intelligence reports tying activists and journalists to foreign militant groups. So the person they're specifically using for this is Brace Belden, and a lot of viewers will be aware of who this person is, but for the uninformed,
His Twitter account used to be Piss Pig Granddad, I believe.
That's exactly right, and it still is, which makes one of the more surreal parts of reading these reports being to scroll down and find that subject of surveillance is someone named Piss Pig Granddad, whose username is Lenin Lover 69. So not, I would say, the world's most serious political activist, but he definitely has an outsized impact, and his specific role in terms of where he fits into the broader left is that he is a high-profile, essentially press secretary, functioning effectively as a press secretary for the YPG militia in Syria. So he was attempting very openly for months, I believe years actually, to help carve out this sort of Kurdish, nominally workers' democracy,
autonomous
but
zone in Syria.
Ethno-state, a Kurdish ethno-state in Syria.
He went and actually fought alongside these individuals in Syria throughout the war that was waged on the country.
He did, and he fought alongside not just these YPG militants, but also effectively, even if not actively on the same battlefield as the U.S. Marines.
Right. He could have joined the U.S. Marines and been fighting on the same side in that war, but he just went and joined independently, and so he was really revered on some left Twitter circles for that.
Yeah, and that's, another conversation really about, I think, the ability of the State Department in general, and its more pliant media outlets to set the terms of the agenda in terms of legitimate leftism. But what it also says is that they really have no real ability to connect any of these journalists or activists to foreign powers, as has been the case since they first attempted with Max Blumenthal, because he had the audacity to wear a T-shirt that had the eyes of Chavez on it. This turned almost into an international incident where it was assumed that somehow the United Socialist Party of Venezuela was behind the unrest in the United States in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd.
Imposter Guaido Foreign Minister Julio Borges even tweeted out the image and tried to claim that this was proof of Venezuela's influence in the United States. Officials in Miami making similar comments, calling for an FBI investigation, I believe, into the relationship between demonstrators and the Venezuelan government. Totally absurd.
absurd. And in this case, it is as well, although it seems they've finally at least found someone who actually was engaged in a military campaign. It just so happens
It's not
that it
very
was a
threatening.
military campaign that the United States government was itself pushing. So they've
Right.
known about Grace Belden's activism in Syria for some time. This is, to me, a pretty clear attempt to just sort of smear different leftist labels. When you look at the actual document, some of the choice sentences here, they describe Grace Belden as a minor criminal and drug addict who started reading Marx and Lenin in drug rehabilitation treatment. And they make further references to a Kurdish member of the Kurdish liberation movement who they surveilled his social media and discovered, quote, multiple conversations where he admitted to being an anarchist, anti-imperialist, and socialist, and was attempting to meet with fellow socialists and anarchists in multiple countries, including Cuba and Venezuela, which is honestly kind of bizarre.
Very
It
confused
shows the
individual.
ideological sort of incoherence of what they are proposing, that anarchists fighting against the Syrian government are secretly allied with the Cuban and Venezuelan revolutionary movements. It bears very little resemblance to reality, but I think it's important to understand it as part of the broader attempt to demonize those ideologies which are deemed legitimate threats to the status quo in the United States and to the ruling class more generally.
Now, especially as we've recently seen confirmation that Kurdish forces are collaborating with the United States to sell off Syria's oil, which should belong to the sovereign Syrian state, I think it's proof that fighting on behalf of the Kurds was in no way actually threatening to U.S. government interests in Syria. In fact, the Kurds were simply tools of the U.S. in that case. So, Wyatt, getting back to Portland, you recorded a viral video showing federal agents arresting a woman after she attempted to hand them flowers. How has this image maybe come to symbolize some of the protests in around the country? And do we know anything more about this woman and what exactly happened here?
I was unable to follow up with the woman in particular. Her arrest was, if anything, one of the more, as strange as it sounds to say, one of the more justifiable ones I viewed, just in the sense that she was relatively close to the DHS agents who arrested her. I don't believe she made any physical contact, but at least in that case, they could kind of say that she was in their personal space, I guess. That, I think, that video you're referring to, it symbolizes to me a kind of perspective on protest and on resistance more broadly that is focused fundamentally on aesthetic, that may misunderstand fundamentally the dynamics that are happening here. I think this kind of tactic, right, attempting to put these agents on trial for the public to view, this works a lot better when you have a media apparatus that is fully willing and fully on board with the sort of pro-democracy freedom movement, however it is generally framed in the countries which we see these images lifted from. They don't work here in the United States because the ruling class, the mass media, generally has less interest in enacting regime change here. They certainly do have an interest in embarrassing Donald Trump and in helping out his political opponents to a certain extent. But I don't think that they're really willing to actually overthrow the United States government to get rid of Donald Trump. And so ultimately, there is no real backbone to with which to I'll say that again. There's no hard right hand with which to back up that soft left. So when protesters push out images like this designed to, or they're hoping to elicit some sort of popular outrage, that can help, sure. But it's certainly not going to be treated like it was if it took place in Iran or in Venezuela, or especially not in Hong Kong. It's going to be taken as another, as we see protests more broadly in the United States, which is to say, perhaps people with legitimate grievances, but not an authoritarian regime, as people so frequently refer to those in the crosshairs of the U.S. government. And so, again, fundamentally, when you go out and draw on this gene-sharp playbook, whether that be trying to hand flowers to the federal agents, or as the woman who they refer to as the Portland Athena, whether that in the case of the Portland Athena, whether that be exposing yourself to the police and displaying your genitals in some act of defiance, these things may generate headlines, clickbait, outrage from the right wing, scorn from the hard left, and applause from the liberals. But they don't fundamentally move the needle in terms of the conditions of people on the ground. It's ultimately fairly meaningless.
Very well said. Legislation put forward would require officers to display identifying information in a visible fashion at all times, and also ban agents from using unmarked vehicles during arrests. What do you make of these proposals, and how do demonstrators in Portland view the Democratic Party?
Protesters in Portland don't view the Democratic Party as their friend. I'll say that much. From the very beginning, from the first night I was there, in which Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler attempted to calm the crowd, he made his first appearance before demonstrators. It was extremely clear that he did not have the loyalty of the thousands of protesters in the streets. If anything, they viewed him as an impediment to real justice. So it took him about a half an hour to get through maybe 5 minutes of remarks, because he was constantly being shouted down, heckled from the crowd. Those attempting to give him a platform would have to sort of wrangle the crowd back into silence, only for the cycle to repeat itself. So just from how I've seen these politicians received on an interpersonal level, I can't say that those who form the real backbone of this anti-police brutality movement in Portland will be cowed by the Democratic proposals. I will say I think that they are ultimately pretty performative. I myself, immediately after Mayor Wheeler's speech, was able to confront him about the federal agents disappearing protesters in response to these horrifying images of unidentified men, presumably agents in military fatigues, snatching up protesters seemingly at random into unmarked rental vans. After those images gained traction, Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner publicly stated that he didn't care what kind of uniforms anyone was wearing, that if someone did that kind of a thing, they would be arrested for kidnapping. So I asked Mayor Wheeler whether federal agents who kidnap people would be arrested. And at first he tried to change the subject and said there's already an investigation into what's happening. And I said, will you commit to arresting feds who kidnap you? Will you commit to arresting feds who kidnap people? And he said, feds who kidnap people? Hell yes. It's illegal to kidnap people.
We just wanted to know what that guy's name was.
Ted, will you commit to arresting DHS who kidnap people? Philadelphia Attorney General Larry Kastner committed to arresting feds.
Fucking job.
Will you commit to arresting feds?
Police.
Will you commit to arresting feds who kidnap people, Ted?
It's already under investigation.
Will you commit to arresting feds who kidnap people?
If they kidnap people, hell yes.
Yeah, if they
It's
drive
illegal.
people and they
It
snatch
is
them up.
illegal to kidnap.
It's happened many times, right? Has it not happened dozens of times already? Ted, has it not happened?
And then he turned and walked away. As I said, isn't it happening already? Hasn't it happened dozens of times? He ignored those questions, which I think is pretty telling. That's where the Democratic Party is at. They will offer you lip service to the most, to help address some of the most barbaric treatment you're receiving, the things that go beyond the pale, but really only insofar as they delegitimize the American brand, right? Their interest is less so in providing redress for victims of systemic oppression and injustice, and more in ensuring the long-term longevity of the imperialist project. So when they provide these sorts of solutions, you'll see that they really address only 5 or 10% of the broader demands that people are out in the streets making. And even then, they can only ever address these issues through this very legalistic, judicially obsessed kind of mentality, where they'll only ever oppose him in the sense that he is breaking specific laws, and not in the sense that he is, rather that the police are serving as an instrument of white supremacist domination and of internal colonization.
And so do you see as the marquee proposals as an extension of that, just moving the law and not necessarily addressing the structural concern here?
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen from the very beginning from the Democrats. Every real demand that the protesters brought out, in the beginning it was defund the police. What was the response by the Democrats? Well, we're going to give $300 billion more, or $300 million more to police. In different cities across the country, this was the response across the board, whether that be Joe Biden, whether that be here in D.C., Democratic Mayor Muriel Bowser. Really, I think we have to stop having any faith in any of these proposals that the Democrats are offering. We have to really even stop assuming that they're being presented in good faith, if we are still doing that, because it's becoming increasingly clear that their only purpose really here is to misdirect and reorient the most popular energy behind these protests and redirect it back into electoral politics, into this sort of back and forth horse race, just following on up. Sorry.
We just got to get Biden elected and then everything will be better. I
Gonna go back to normal, right?
Right, everything will be great again, just like under the Obama administration when there were no Black Lives Matter protests or police killings, right?
Or deportations.
Right, yeah, none of that, just it didn't happen. So on the you brought up deportations just now, and earlier you mentioned the role of Border Patrol and obviously Homeland Security in this deployment of federal officers around the country. And so I'm wondering, as someone who I know is also very involved in anti-imperialist demonstrations, we work together on the Venezuelan Embassy Protection Collective. You've done great work on Bolivia, on Nicaragua, on Venezuela. How does what we're experiencing here in the United States right now relate to that struggle that we've engaged in on the international level in showing solidarity with these countries that are victims and targets of U.S. imperialism?
Well, I think for the first time, a lot of Americans who define themselves as broadly opposed to the imperialist injustices perpetrated by this government, they've gotten a taste of what that occupation might look like from the other side. Obviously, it's nowhere near the same. They're not using live ammunition like they were in Bolivia in the two massacres in November, which happened as the military attempted to crack down on protests which sprung up in opposition to the US-backed coup against the country's first indigenous president, Evo Morales. And on a related note, we see today those same types of protests springing all across Bolivia as labor organizers, indigenous activists, and all types of social movements demand elections as were promised for September 6th, but which the Anya's regime has since moved up to October, and there's some doubt whether they intend to have elections at all.
It's the third time they've delayed elections.
Yeah, which, at this point, I think people are saying, fool me once, shame on me, fool me, can't get fooled again, as George Bush put it. There's no doubt in a lot of these organizers' minds that at this point, they're not going to get elections until they force them in the streets. Returning to the similarities in terms of the state repression being employed to crack down on protests, they're very clearly drawing from the same playbook. Even these kinds of disappearances into vans. This was something that we saw all throughout the United States government's dirty wars in Latin America, throughout Operation Condor, as it was referred to. And even recently, in Bolivia, this was another tactic which the right wing was employing, by which the right wing paramilitaries, who are functionally equivalent to their brethren in Venezuela and in Nicaragua, other states where the right wing and fascists have attempted coups, these fascists were also disappearing people into vans who they deemed political opponents, with the tacit approval of the state. The difference in the United States, this was the actual government doing it. They didn't need to employ paramilitaries, although that sort of thing happens very frequently. Connections there are a little bit less direct, generally speaking. But all these same tactics are really part of a broader guidebook for controlling dissent that we see throughout the United States and throughout its so-called allies, really its client states and vassals, especially Israel. most notably Israel, because in covering the protests in Portland, one recurring comment that I have gotten from anti-imperialist journalists has been to remark on the similarity between the treatment of journalists in Portland and the treatment of journalists in the West Bank. They're being treated, or we were essentially being treated up until just a few days ago, as effectively enemy combatants and as valid targets for state repression. So these are, again, something that you don't have to look too far to see. You see the kind of repression of journalists in Bolivia from the very first day of the coup. They were frog marching out journalists who were sympathetic to labor organizers. They frog marched them out of their office, either hog-tied them or tied them to trees, and tortured many. Something we also saw in Nicaragua during the attempted coup of 2018. Treatment of journalists who were seen as sympathetic to the to leftists and leftist causes as effectively being agents of those causes and being treated in many cases even worse than the demonstrators, because it's not just a war as it is in the United States, whether that be in Portland or DC or Chicago, Minneapolis. It's not just a war of the police against demonstrators. It's a war of the state against anyone who really dares resist. And for that reason, it's so important that we be extremely critical of attempts by the democratic establishment to ingratiate themselves with the left and to co-opt and ultimately control the direction of the movement.
Well, finally, Wyatt, just to wrap, where can viewers follow your work?
Yeah, definitely. Please check me out on Twitter at Wyatt Reed 13. That's at WYATTREED 13. People should also check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. We air every weekday from 2 to 4 p.m. So check me out there, here. I'm sure we'll be talking again at some point soon.
We sure will. And yes, I second that. Everyone should give Wyatt a follow and also listen to By Any Means Necessary. You can find it, I think, on podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, on SoundCloud,
iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and you can listen live on SputnikNews.com.
Absolutely. So Wyatt Reed, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks, Anya.